So before we get started on how to use the 3D printer here, I want you to know just a few basics, some real basic safety things. First of all, if you ever touch this when the printer's going, just avoid this area, it's very hot. The heated bed could be really hot as well. So just be real careful with that. The second thing is when you get here, the printer should be unplugged from the previous time. So you're going to want to come and plug in the printer for safety's sake and get power to it. Before you leave, make sure you unplug the printer just for safety's sake again. We could probably get away with leaving it plugged in, but there's a lot of reasons why we wouldn't want to do that, because the hot end could get left on if you had a failed print that you canceled. And sometimes people won't turn it off in the setting in the software, which we're going to learn about in a little bit later in the video. So you got to make sure it's off before you leave, just to be fair. Otherwise, the filament will bake in there and get some clogs, and it would make it very difficult for other people to use it. So this is a step that people often forget, so we're going to take care of it first, is we need to first prepare the print surface. You can see that there's these clips here, and if it gets too mucked up after a while, you're going to want to take this and clean it off using either some isopropyl alcohol that we have right on the cabinet right up there, or you can take it over some hot water. We'll usually take hairspray off also, but although that'll take a little bit longer. So you want to, you don't have to clean it every time. I just want you to know that if it's too gummed up and nasty, after a while you will need to clean it. But let's forget about that. The first step, what you're going to want to do, generally speaking, is just grab this hairspray. Sorry, I'm trying to film with one hand here. And you're just going to apply an even coat over the surface. And don't be afraid to put a little extra on there. It's not a big deal. You can kind of see it evaporating, especially when we turn the heater bed on. It will evaporate and change from liquid to this sort of sticky plastic. And that just is going to help this plastic stick to this plate, because while you're printing, if the plastic doesn't adhere to this, then the part moves around and the print gets screwed up and the layers don't align properly. Now that we have the build surface prepared and we're going to make sure that we unplug things when we're finished, let's start off here, and I'm going to explain the process. You're going to start off with an STL file. That's just the way that three-dimensional files are shared on the internet. If you design anything in software, you should export it as an STL if you want to 3D print it. Then you have to change it. You use Cura, which is a slicer program, and that slices it up into layers and switches it into what we call a toolpath, which is a G-code file. Now, the difference is that this model just has like the shape of it, whereas the G-code file is actually, the slicer program converts it to a G-code file, which will actually tell the printer, go left this far, go right this far, whatever. It's just basically a list of lines that the printer needs to follow to make this object. And that's different for every, the reason you have to run it through a slicer program is that every printer is a little bit different. So you can't make that generically. It's got to be special for your printer. And then what you do is you take that list of instructions and you put it in the control software in Windows, and the control software that we're going to show you, it's called Repetier Server, which is run through the web browser, will send it to the printer and tell the printer to do its thing. Heat up, move this line here, do whatever. You know, there's thousands of these lines that it takes to make a 3D printed object. So what we're going to do the first step is this STL file part, right? So let's go ahead and take care of that. First. So what you need to do is to grab an STL file, and this just depends on your preference. Today, because I want it to print very quickly, I'm going to use this one, which is a card kit. And when you cut it out, you can assemble it together to make this little airplane. So it's kind of a fun little project that you make, and then you get to make again by assembling it. So you go to Thing Files, and I'll just grab this, the Howard DG15. Now it'll download into our download file. So now what we're going to do, this is really important. I've cleaned off the junk off the desktop. Please don't save anything at all to the desktop anymore. I want it to be very minimalistic so that people can find these things that they need very quickly and easily. If you have something to save, don't save it on the desktop. So here we go. We're going to go to Cura, and I'm going to launch Cura first of all. And Cura, as we saw in our overview, that's our slicer program. So now we're in this step, the slicer program. Now what does Cura do? It breaks it down, and these are settings. Now listen, you should assume that somebody at the makerspace has probably been tinkering with this. So what you need to do, first of all, before you do anything else, you want to make sure that you go in and, since we're on the Delta, first go to the machine up. You know what? This should say the yellow Delta. So I'm going to change the machine name right now, actually. Yellow Delta printer. Okay. And so now we're on the correct printer. If you want to print on the little Seahawks printer, you're going to use this one. So the yellow Delta printer is selected. And now what I want you to do is to make sure that no one else has messed around with it, to give you some real fail-safe settings that will probably, some things could go wrong, but generally speaking, these settings are safe and they'll work. You're going to go to File and you're going to go to Open Profile. And I've saved some profiles and go to the desktop. Again, we want to keep the desktop clean because people need to dig through here for these profiles. And go to Cura Print Settings. And here I have yellow Delta PLA settings. And I'm going to load those up and it'll go back to the defaults, which generally speaking work pretty well. They're not the fastest, but they're going to be more reliable, and that's what we need. For most people who are new enough to need to watch this video to know what they're doing, they're going to want reliability and just so that they can experience some joy with 3D printing and not just problems. So if you're new, you just load those up. You can tinker with some things in here, but you should always assume that someone else has messed with it. So the philosophy we have now is just load up every time that you do it. If you want to make sure it's right, go to Open Profile and load up the profile for that printer. All right, so now that you've done that and you've made sure you've loaded up the correct profile, now what we're going to do is we're going to go into the Windows file browser and I'm going to go to Downloads. I'm just going to kind of drag this. There's my file, the Howard DG15. And I drag my file right out here. And now you can see it's been set up and getting ready to print. So it's telling me a few things, that this is going to take about 13 minutes and it's going to use a certain amount of plastic. Now that time isn't going to be exactly right because there's some other factors in that, but it gives you a little idea. And I hate to tell you, one thing that's bad is 3D printing does take some time. If you print tall models that are very large, you're going to be here many, many hours watching and monitoring the print. So you might want to check that to make sure that you have enough time to be here to monitor it. Okay, so now that we have that, what we're going to do is we're going to save the G-code. Now that thing's done generating G-code, save G-code, and I'm going to do that in the Downloads folder too. And so I'm just going to name it plain, whatever you want, because you're going to have to find that file again. Okay, so now we're done with that part. And we can actually, at this point, we can close out of Cura. Now, let's go take a look at what we just did. We used Cura, and now we're at the point where we have a G-code file. So we're done with that part. Now we need to upload the G-code file into our control software, which will control the printer and give it specific instructions on what it needs to do its job to complete the print. So the control software, I'm going to minimize, is actually run through, it runs in the background, but it actually shows up and it runs through the web browser. And if you look here, 3D printer control, there's a shortcut right here. And look what happens. It opens up a web address that's localhost port 3344 or localhost colon 3344. And now what's really cool is that we're running our control software right through the web browser, right next to this other stuff that we were looking at earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the yellow Delta tower. You can see that it's connected and you can see we're getting temperature readings, which is a good sign. If you don't see that, you can unplug the power to the printer. You can unplug the USB port that goes to the printer and replug it in and turn the power back on if it doesn't show up here. Okay, so now you're going to go to printer. And there's 3 different tabs here. Console, you won't want to use that unless you really know what you're doing and sending G-code commands. The 2 that you're going to be interested in are going to be print and control. Mainly just print. So you're going to click here to upload a file. And here's my file, it's called plain, that we made earlier. I kind of like these to be the other way around, so the newest is at the top. And make sure it's the right one. You can check the time of upload. And this is the button that starts the print process. Assuming you got the printer ready to roll and you've put hairspray on the build surface and you've prepped that, we should be ready to go. Also, it would help certainly if you've plugged in the printer, of course. And so I'm going to press print. Now, if you really want to know, is this really doing anything? Because if you didn't have the printer plugged in, but you have the USB plugged in, it's going to think it's going to start heating up, but it really won't work. Let's go to control and check this out. And this little button up here is the temperature. And it gives us a temperature reading. And you can see already the ambient temperature of about 15 or 16 degrees Celsius in here. We're already up to 38 degrees, so the heated bed will heat up first, and after that's done, it will heat up the actual plastic melter, the extruder, or the hot end as we call it, and this print will, or it should, actually begin. You can see the bed is up to about 70 degrees. Once that gets done, it's going to start heating up the hot end, which is this piece right here. Now, to put that in perspective, this is about as hot as your oven's going to get if you turned it on to like 400 and some degrees. You really don't want to touch this very end part here unless you're absolutely certain that the printer is cooled down and whatever. So heated bed's heated up. Now it's going to heat up the part that actually melts the plastic. And right now the settings are at about 215. So once that gets up to about 215 degrees, and it's almost there, let's check it out. It'll home and it goes down, kind of pauses for a second, and it's going to start your print. You want to really keep an eye on it like a hawk for this first level, just because if there's going to be problems with the print, most of them will occur in the first level, not adhering to the bed. That's probably, if you have the right settings, that's probably 90% of the time, the problem is going to be with the very first layer. But now we're printing that. I'm going to pause this and we'll come back and check it out when it's nearly finished. It's almost finished. You can see it's about 75%. You can see that on the print window. Same place where you uploaded your file and press the little print button here. You go to Control and go back to this one here. Some things that are important to know about. If you need to control the temperature and maybe you stop the print, you need to stop it. You can stop it here or pause it here. You can also do that in the print window. Stop and pause if you notice something going wrong or you need to pause it for some reason. If you pause it or stop it and you don't want to finish the print, it's really wise to turn these to off. So change the temperature for the extruder and the heated bed and click here, and you can flick those off with that button there. You could also type in different numbers if you wanted it to be hotter or cooler. But until you know what you're really doing, I recommend you don't mess with those settings. Just kind of use the default settings there. If you wanted to jog the axis, that means move it around. Well, when this isn't printing, there'll be another option for movement, and you can move things up, down, move them around. If you need to stop the stepper motors to move things around, you can click this button over here. So most of the stuff is going to be in this first one under Control, and then the button for Control. There's a filament change button. And of course, we already talked about the temperature. You can also see temperature graphs here. So all extruders in bed, and it will show you a graph of the temperature. From here we can see that our bed's maintaining a pretty nice temperature, right around 70 degrees, like almost exact. So now we're going to switch back here in a second and watch the conclusion of this print. But what you want to do is find a putty knife. You want to make sure that the bed has cooled down. And you can see it is still in the process. You can see the cool down happening. And once it cools down, you should be able to, with a putty knife, assuming it ever shows back up here, you should be able to scrape it right off there and your print will be done. And remember, when you're finished with this and you're about to leave, duck underneath the table. And do me a favor and just unplug the printer completely. You might want to wait a little bit until the actual hot end cools down with the fan, so the active cooling has a time to do its thing. But that'll kind of conclude our video on how to use the Makerspace printers.